Delighted to be here. It's one of those things that you're always excited to have a nice exchange with people who are interested in urban systems and the issues associated with it. And so we're going to, Karima has asked me to focus on something a little more narrow than I normally do, so we're going to talk a little bit about housing values and the impact of transportation on housing values, which is central to urban issues that we're concerned with. My co-author is Zhenhua Chen, who is at Ohio State University, one of my graduate students. Let's see if I can figure out, there we are. This is part of a lot of overall research we're doing on ICT, infrastructure, and regional economies. We've been doing this in the US, China, and India, Tibet. And the focus has been on telecommunications, mobile communications, broadband, transportation. And we've been using various kinds of fairly traditional economic methodologies, demand side partial equilibrium models, panel models, spatial regression, spatial econometrics, CGE, and dynamic CGE modeling. And so that just gives you a framework of where we're coming from. Why high-speed rail in China? Well, it's obvious to anybody who's been to China and been around a little bit. In fact, if you want the truth, this is old stuff already. New China is one belt, one road. And so this is, in some ways, the basement for building all of that activity. We're talking about 20,000 plus miles of high-speed rail built over the last roughly 10 to 12 years. And that's an underestimate, because usually when people talk about that measurement, they're talking about the 8 transnational lines, the 12 interregional lines, and they don't include many of the within regional lines, which are also high-speed rail these days. This accounted for about 10% of the GNP growth during this period of time. So the growth so it's a huge investment. We're talking probably $1 trillion in US terms. And it's 8% of welfare growth in the period between 2000 and 2014. The justification for building this was that was made to Central Party was that it was going to reduce regional disparities in China. That was one of the major components under it. But there is a controversy that's developed in China very heavily, having to do with property values and the impact of high-speed rail on property values. And so that's why we've kind of picked this one as the example. There are some related papers to this that might be of interest to some of you. One is the impact of high-speed rail on environment and economy in China. And there's a section on that looks at land use conversion. 2 kinds of land use conversion. One, the land use conversion from agriculture to where the actual line was built, which is very, very tiny in proportion to the system, and the impact of high-speed rail on economic growth in metropolitan areas and the incremental conversion of land around those areas into urban components. The second paper we did was on urban mass transit and housing prices in Guangzhou, Wuhan, and Chengdu, focusing mainly on regional high-speed rail and mass transit issues. And the one we're going to look at right now is high-speed rail housing values. And this really talks about the housing value where the new rail issues were put in. So that's kind of an outline for you. The issue is rapid development of high-speed rail, the propensity of housing market with rising housing prices. Most of those housing prices were not driven by high-speed rail per se, but certainly there might be a linkage. There is a linkage between high-speed rail development and the prosperity of the housing market, issues that are critical in terms of overall Chinese concerns, and particularly in areas of urban planning and policies. There's a huge literature on this, the impact of transport infrastructure on housing prices. This is just some examples. but there's a literature that goes on and on. There's a focus on, most of it focuses on urban transit, and there's been findings that are both positive, negligible, negative, just to give you an example. And some of the issues that have not been looked at very carefully are the spatial dependency question and the magnitude of the accessibility, and the fact that there's a need for really looking at this kind of spatial consideration as you're looking at the general findings. So we have one of the most advanced high-speed rail systems in the world, generated very, very rapidly. We have the connection between the political center, which is Beijing, and of course the financial center, which is Shanghai. This is a huge region, but it was by far the jewel in the system. The construction was 2008 through 2010. The distance is about 1,300 kilometers, and there are 24 stations on that system. And the operational speeds are between 350 kilometers with maximum speeds of 380 kilometers. They don't really run at that speed. If you look at them, they're running usually slightly over 300, but somewhere in that neighborhood. This is the region we're talking about. The first thing to notice, of course, is the piece of high-speed rail from Beijing to Tianjin, which has actually been in place for a long time. That's an area that was already developed very quickly, and it's really the next set that gets you down to Shanghai that's so important. The data set is 1,000 housing properties across these 24 cities. We selected this from the Sufun founding, which are information about what the price is being asked for different housing. We looked at the Beidou maps for neighboring environments, schools, parks, hospitals, shopping centers, things like that, and local characteristics such as other roads, ports, and things in that neighborhood. And one of the areas that's always advertised is whether it's near a high-speed rail line, when in fact you're looking for these kinds of advertisements in the system. We look at the housing value itself, we look at the area size, we are concerned with whether it's completed or not, what the floor area ratio looks like, a greening measure for how green it is in the local area, a per capita income measure, and whether it's a residential building, an apartment building, a villa, or an office building. And finally, the two key things here are distance to the high-speed rail station and the distance in terms of driving time. So we've got both a measure to the actual distance and a measure in terms of the time distance, and of course you need to control for the distance from the city center, because all of these aren't necessarily in the city center. Now, I have to tell you that we first did this and we ran it, and of course, we expect the normal kind of element where you have a station, you have a set of information about it, you would expect the distance decay function around the station is, kind of the classic 101 things, at least that's what I learned about years ago. And that's what we kind of expected, and the answer is, we first ran it and the answer was, we didn't see any of that. So what were we missing? We found all the other controls that we had were appropriate. And one of the things we began looking at was this element of this column on the left here, differentiation between the capital versus the municipal city that it was going through. And that became an important determinant, and we'll kind of show you why in terms of the elements. But we also collected the time, the minutes, and the kilometers from the high-speed rail to each of the properties. The first thing to note is the difference between the values that are capital city values versus those that are non-capital city values. And remember, there's only 5 capital cities in this grouping and 17 non-capital cities. So we start off with a kind of robust OLS traditional regression, and then we work with a Box-Cox transformed maximum likelihood model, and we use both a constrained and an unconstrained model. And that's mainly because we've got 0 and 1s, and we've got some less than well-behaved distributions. Second, last, we look at a spatial econometric estimation to get some idea of what is happening in the system itself. And the model is on the urban system as a whole, and then we separate it for capital and then for the non-capital cities. And this begins to give you an idea of what we're finding. This is the analysis just of the robust OLS. You can see that we have positive and significance with regard to floor area, which you'd expect, with regard to completed or not, critical, with whether it's residential building, you're not surprised. Buses nearby fell out. Bus systems and bus stops nearby were not significant. That's mainly, as I was told later, because the uncertainty with regard to buses arriving so you can't kind of count on it, so people were very wise in not using that very well. But also the issue of the schools, parks nearby, hospitals, in other words, some measure of public services of various kinds. And you can see that if we look at the whole model say 3 and model 6, you can see that we get nothing that's serious with regard to high-speed rail station in kilometers, nothing with regard to minutes. If you look at it with regard to the transformed Box-Cox thing, you'll see that in effect we get things that we don't expect. If you look at the capital, we find that we get a positive instead of a negative value. The non-capital, we get a negative value, and that begins to give us a hint of what's going on here with regard to this. And we do this for both the restrictive and the unrestrictive model, and we get very, very similar results. And what we find is that when we begin to do the spatial analysis, it begins to explain exactly what's happening. And so with the OLS, with capital cities, we get a positive effect when we expected a negative. The non-capital cities were negative as expected, and the overall effect was positive, slightly positive. With regard to time, with regard to distance, we find the capital, again, is not significant, but would be on the positive side. The non-capital is negative and significant, and the overall effect is basically neutral. But what it tells us when we look at the spatial econometrics piece is that the direct effects and the indirect effects are critical in driving these total effects. And that is that if we look at the direct effects on the capital side, it's negative and significant. The indirect effects are positive, and that's what gives us the overall effect of that capital not being an effective measure of the overall component. And we see the same thing if you look at the travel by distance. We get a negative effect appropriately, we get a slight positive effect, but we still get a negative effect overall by time and by distance. And if we look at non-capital, we get a similar explanation of the way in which direct and indirect effects trade off against each other, producing our final results. And we would not know that if we did not climb into the kind of spatial econometric component of these overall effects. So what this amounts to is the fact that in the center part of these cities, there's already a significant amount of land already built up. And so when you put a station in, effectively, you're not having an effect on those because it's already built up. It's in those smaller centers where you put it, and then you get the effect that you would expect to find with regard to an overall mapping. So the significant impact of high-speed rail accessibility on housing values is found in the case of the high-speed rail line is that it has a significant effect. Such inner impacts vary substantially between the provincial capitals and the non-capitals, and that the spatial interdependency of the housing values is confirmed without appropriately addressing this issue of spatial dependency. Any estimated coefficient would be biased and inefficient. So that's a full-scale part of this is available on the SSRN website, and with the data, et cetera, associated with it. We'd be delighted if anyone would take it and use it, because I spent some time putting it together. And if you want to see some more about Chinese high-speed rail, there's a 2015 book that we finished looking at the issues associated with that, particularly related to technology transfer, financing, and innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kingsley. That was an admirably and appropriately high-speed presentation on high-speed rail in China. Comments, questions, contestations? Dave, first of all.
So Kingsley, my question is actually about speed. About speed.
Speed, yes.
I think, you know, some of the previous literature on these kinds of things have been done not in the Chinese context, but in cases like the building of the BART system,
sure,
or the Washington Metro, where it took quite a while for the impacts to really be felt and for a redevelopment to take place.
We control for the time on this one as to when it was completed. In fact, in the other, we have another one in which we looked at all of the lines for this, for China that have been completed, controlling for the times and then doing a lag, 2-year lag, to try to look at it. One of the difficulties is that you've probably also got speculation on the front end as well. So yes, we allowed for the lag in this end, but there's probably, we probably could even have a lag longer than that, because there's speculation going on at the early end, because these are picked out early, these locations as to where the stations are going to be.
Right, and the demand was just so much there to start with.
Demand has two characteristics to it. Number one is the general demand in the system, and the second is the demand during the high period, which is the spring vacation, if you wish, where everyone goes home. And that was what got the government in a lot of trouble 2 or 3 times, where they couldn't carry the numbers. Now, what's interesting to me is that although they can carry the numbers now, in fact, the numbers have dropped. Because the other thing that's happened in the system is we have vehicles now in the system. And so the result is that although the government has done this for one purpose, in effect it's been successful for other reasons as well. And so it's kind of an interesting kind of trade-off, if you wish, that the demand has fallen in terms of this. Now, the government did some other things which were very important. Number one, it decreased the number of routes that had the low-cost routes. So the frequency rates went down and the prices went up at the bottom end. That created a squeeze, if you wish, for the higher-priced high-speed rail, and you've raised the price of the traditional alternative, and you've reduced the frequency of the alternative. So that's driven people to the high-speed rail. On the other hand, you need to understand that although this was unbelievably exciting, and in construction terms, engineering terms, it's a marvel. In economic terms, to some extent, it's fascinating, because one of the benefits that never shows up on these models is the fact that, remember, this is primarily passenger. And of course, what has it done to the other? It's released freight availability on the other lines. And passenger and freight do not operate on the same lines cooperatively, shall we say. And so there's an indirect benefit here that doesn't usually show up in a lot of people's analysis for these kinds of activities.
We had Mercedes next, and then Roger, and then Ed.
Thank you. So Really enjoyed your presentation. Two quick questions. Do you see economic convergence across the city as a result of these high-speed rail trains, right? Do we see that cities that were growing very slowly now, because you're moving people and knowledge and ideas, you see they're starting to grow faster? And the other question is, you've been focusing on the effect on housing prices. What about the effect on innovation? What about the effect on other performance dimensions? I don't know if you have looked at that.
I don't know if I can answer the second one. The first one, in a separate paper, we've taken the national, the 3 regions, and the 8 regions of China. And after we've controlled for various elements, we find that high-speed rail did have a positive effect in reducing interregional differences. And that's because it had a very positive effect on the southwest area of China, pulling it in, and the center part. It did not have as great effect as the government was hoping on western China, and it had a positive but smaller effect on the coastal area because they were already well connected. It's like anything else. You may get a marginal contribution, but it's going to be much smaller to a place that's already well connected as opposed to being less well connected. So we did that by looking at both a set of gravity models associated with it and potential models, and finally commuting models around all the metropolitan areas to see how it changed the labor patterns.
Kingsley, a couple observations. They're not sensational, I guess, in a way, but it's interesting that, when you put a new system, sizable infrastructure investment in an underdeveloped area, it has a huge impact. You put it in the middle of a big city and it gets swallowed by the size around it. So you had the same effect in a way on this. And secondly, we have road pricing, and particularly in Washington, we put these parallel systems in that are priced, and what happens, it creates not only extra capacity for people who want to pay, but it reduces the demand on the other, so you actually get an improved time on both systems when you first put them in. The thing that they don't do in Washington is to raise the cost on using the old system and so on, which was very interesting in this case.
This relates to something that we would like to do next, and that is, although we've seen the contributions in both places here, the argument should be that over time, the contribution of high-speed rail should become less as the rest of the system is integrated. In other words, if you look at the U.S. Northeast Corridor and the work we've done there, we find that the investment is, very large investment, but the contribution is relatively small to economic activity. The direct effect, the indirect effect's not bad, but the direct effects are almost, not there. The system is really well connected already. And although people argue about congestion, it's more in the urban area than the inter-urban system. And so we just don't see it. We couldn't pick it out anyway.
So
yes.
I was interested in 2 issues. One of which was in terms of, I was a Sherwin-Rosen student, so I'm really glad that you're doing this. One of which is the question of where do they cite these are not before-after things, right? These are cross-sectional hedonics. So
these were,
yeah.
Yes.
So I guess one question is, can we do some placebos looking beforehand? I was just looking on the map of where Beijing South was and what was there before it was built and so forth. So one thing that would be nice is to go back prior to the construction and see whether or not it actually was really crappy land that was originally built in.
Or do it now about 3 or 4 years afterwards and see what it begins to look like as well. So the before and after. The difficulty of doing it before is the material you're getting at is not well stored in China. You know what I mean? We were getting it off of newspaper and other advertisement Pardon?
So Fun doesn't have the stuff going. So Fun is Chinese Zillow, by the way. If anyone, so I've used it, except they're 10 times the size of American Zillow.
I began to look at it again, but at the time it was very hard to find because we were going to do it that way to start with.
The other thing that I was interested in is often you find for these price hedonics for American transportation infrastructure very clear nonlinearity, where the stuff that's right near the highway is priced less, and then it
goes, has that crater effect.
Right, exactly. So I was interested in I assumed you'd played around with that, and I just didn't know.
We played with half kilometer, 1 kilometer to see if and we couldn't get it in the capital cities. But remember, there's only 5 of them there, and but they're big cities, I mean, they're Chinese capital cities.
Absolutely.
And those intermediate cities are all over 1 million.
Yes.
So it's very interesting.
Yes. Great.
But
very nice, Kingsley. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay.
So one serious question and one more really naive question. The serious one is about do you get measures of informal economic activity focusing around the stations when you do this kind of research in terms of promote informal as opposed to formal, since that's so important in China? Yeah. And then my second question, which is the more naive question, which is, when I heard you talk about making the local rail that is no longer, bringing up those prices, what's the impact on an incredibly poverty-stricken people, in which we know that, especially around these large cities, that we have these large floating populations of immigrants who don't have hokao and who have no place to live and are, really quite destitute, sleep on the streets.
Absolutely.
Because of this, I asked the question of, is it because it makes no somehow economic sense for the system as a whole that one wouldn't leave those prices down for this population that China has yet to really grapple with, of what they're going to do for them?
I would say that, in effect, that population is not using these high-speed rail. And I would say the high-speed rail is biased to the upper income groups, middle to upper income group, especially if they're being used on a regular basis. Now,
but what about the old rail you were saying that was being left?
They're definitely being used by the lower income population, and those are the ones they've decreased the frequency and raised the price on.
But why did they raise the price? I guess that's the part.
Because they want to drive everybody up to the high-speed rail.
But they know they have a population who will never make it.
And so they're trying to close that financial gap between the two. Yes, they're less concerned about that.
Okay,
I mean,
that's all.
I go to China, I was there 86, 87. I can remember the discussion of I think it was the 2nd ring road or 3rd ring road in Beijing at that time. 1 year. I said, how could you do it in 1 year? We couldn't even get permits to get the system together in 5 years. And the answer was 1 year. And you go to a village and it's right through the village. They put the pass-throughs under the village, or they move a piece of the village. But, this is the command and control economy. This is not, despite our terms for using the word market, it's only pieces of it that are market sensitive. Like the one I was discussing, the housing is a little bit that way.
To make you feel any better, the rumors in China are also that they screw up the flights from Beijing to Shanghai as well to try and get you on high-speed rail. So they're not just disturbing the transport for the poor people, they're also disturbing the transport for the richer people as well.
And there's been
socialist in that sense.
and there's been an impact of this on flights. There's actually been a reduction in the number of flights between Beijing and Shanghai, despite the growth, despite the income, because of this alternative. And
right, so it hurts on both
you can look at a couple of others, other links, and do the same analysis.
Just that they had an opportunity to provide public transportation at a lower cost for the poor population at the same time of improving the transportation for everybody else, let's say.
I understand.
A missed opportunity, in other words. Thank you very much, Kingsley.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your comments and questions.